Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from sunny West London. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, I am very pleased to welcome one of my favourite economic commentators and creator of the wonderful blog of2minds.com, Charles Hugh-Smith. Charles is the author of Get a Job, Build a Career, Defy a Bewildering Economy, and the recently published A Radically Beneficial World, Automation, Technology, and Creating Jobs for All. Charles, thank you so much for your time.
Gordon, it's my pleasure to be on your show. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, you're very welcome. I regularly share your insights amongst the Rune Soup people, and in fact, in some of your books, you drop a few kind of enigmatic autobiographical comments. You used to be a carpenter and so on. So there's a question we tend to start the shows with here, which is, Charles, were you a weird kid?
To the degree that I never really fit in and struggled to create the illusion that I fit in, at least some of the lesser weird circles, yes.
I see. So you're like a sleeper weird agent. You sort of pretend to move amongst the normals.
Well, I had to move around a lot of schools due to peripatetic parents, shall we say. So I was often the new kid in town, and before about the age of 15 or 16, I was quite small and skinny and easy prey, shall we say, for bullies. And of course, those of you who've been the new kid in town, you're acutely aware that bullies realize you have no friends, no support, and you are a really easy target. So your first job as the new kid in town is to acquire some sort of circle, and it can be the nerds, the geeks, the other weirdos, but you don't really want to be alone. So my strategy was, even though I was a completely mediocre athlete, I happened to go to small schools who anybody that had a pulse could show up and get on the team, even if you were a bench warmer or cannon fodder on the field. So anyways, I joined as many teams as I could, and that gave me a little bit of protection against that. So I don't know if that's relevant, but being the new kid in town, you know, get used to being lonely. You get used to spending a lot of time in your own head. You spend a lot of time reading, and you spend some time strategizing how to avoid getting beaten up.
To me, I think that does sound quite a bit relevant, because you're sort of sizing up and viewing dispassionately the opportunities that present themselves to you at the time. But there's also, I mean, you just mentioned you spend a lot of time in your own head and reading. Are there any particular books you remember that you would consider transformative at a young peripatetic age?
I think, like a lot of young people that don't fit in, science fiction was quite a passion in my teen years and 20s. So, of course, you start with things like Asimov's Foundation trilogy and some of the classic stories from that era, and then you move on through what was written in the 70s, the Mode in God's Eye, I recall, and so I can't recall even a small portion of all the science fiction I read, but that was important. And then I discovered the sort of French existentialist novelists at about 15 or 16, Albert Camus and a bit of André Gide and Jean-Paul Sartre. And so these very, in the case of Camus, very cleanly written, very, very stripped down stories of the human condition, the source of morality and our choices and our sort of raison d'etre, our reason for existence. These, of course, were practically written for the weird teenager seeking the meaning of life. So I pursued that in university and got a degree in philosophy. And at that time, I extended my interest into Buddhism, Taoism, a bit of Hinduism, the Asian philosophies, which are, as we all know, quite different from the European philosophy.
Fascinating. So this is probably the oddest podcast you've been on so far, but I knew somewhere in there would be a reason why that would be the case, and kind of being pleasantly brainwashed by science fiction as a kid tends to create unique adults. So I'm sure that's where it is. When you talk about studying philosophy, was that, I mean, where were you at this point? Did you move for that as well? Would you describe yourself as someone who doesn't mind a bit of a wander?
Yes, I suppose one gets used to changing environments when you're forced to do so as a child, and so you don't really question it as a child. You just go, well, that's what life is. Every 2 or 3 years you move. So I have extended my periods of time in various places as I grew older, and I spent about 17 years in Hawaii, but I did split that among 3 islands of the 7 main islands, and so I did get a variety there. And then I moved back to California and have sort of found myself drawn to Berkeley, which is, despite the many changes and the sort of shall we say, yuppification of the San Francisco Bay Area, Berkeley is still a locale that allows for free thinking and attracts a lot of free thinkers in a variety of fields, so it's quite comfortable here. And I should also say that, in terms of education, when I was in university, I felt that I didn't really have any solid practical life skills, and I felt that this was a real deficiency, and that just book learning had its place, but it wasn't enough. And so that's why I was drawn to start working in construction, and I needed to make money. And of course, the pay in construction, even as a beginner, is about double what you'd earn in a bookstore or a cafe. So that was also a reason to enter construction. And so I sort of was pursuing a dual education path. I was pursuing my interest in philosophy, which is, as we know, a famously worthless degree in terms of employment.
I have a film degree. Don't worry about that. I know exactly what you mean. You're in good company here.
Yeah, and so that's part of being weird, is to pursue one's interests even when all the rational people around you are kindly suggesting that you do something more practical. But the carpentry and the other related trades that I learned provided me with a livelihood. And it's to me, I would recommend it to anyone, that you have a balance of that kind of real world skills, whether it's welding, cooking, gardening, that you're able to create value with your hands and mind, and then you also have intellectual, spiritual, soulful, pursuits. And so that seems to me to be a decent balance. And if we think about the message of Buddhism or Taoism and some of the Asian philosophies, having a balance is one of the higher goals of one's advancement in life.
Well, that's a really good answer, and it sort of foreshadows some questions that I have for later on, but we'll just jump into them now, because you've written quite extensively about this, and I think there's a tremendous amount of useful information for people out there. But in addition to the balance, I mean, can we extend that advice further to someone who is, say, looking at their college options right now? Like, what would be, in the United States, best practice for someone going, I'm looking at college, what should I do?
Right. And that is a key question. And it raises many issues which are systemic or structural. In other words, they're unrelated to who's in office or the political crisis of the day or the economic policy of the central bank. They're much deeper than that. And so what I'm referring to is the role of education in the economy. And a lot of people have written about this, and we all I think, sort of intuit that this was the way it worked was when the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century and early 20th century required semi-skilled workers. Then universal education was implemented so that the workforce learned how to read and write and could follow instructions and be better factory workers. And then as the second, what many people refer to as the second industrial revolution occurred in the mid-century, mid-20th century, then a lot of factory jobs were already being automated, and the jobs were in communication, sales, marketing, finance, these kinds of things. And then a college degree became a necessary, at least for managers and higher level employees in this new white collar world. And now we've reached the third, or some people say the fourth, depending on how you count the initial stages of the Industrial Revolution. Now we're in a new phase in which AI, software, robotics, that whole suite of technologies is replacing not just factory jobs, but white-collar jobs are being automated or partially automated. And so now the educational system is in a way in a crisis, because the training people with the conventional university degree doesn't necessarily fit the needs of the economy, and it doesn't necessarily provide that student with the secure employment that they were promised, either explicitly or implicitly. And so it's become a bit of a free-for-all where the students have to do, they can't just passively accept what the university puts out as a useful curriculum. And they certainly have to avoid, in the U.S., acquiring a vast crushing burden of student debt for a degree that may very well be essentially worthless. It has no scarcity value. And not to belabor the point, but that's the other thing, is back in the mid-20th century through the 70s and even 80s, a college degree was fairly scarce in the economy. Perhaps 20% of people had college experience or a diploma. And now the numbers in the developed world, Europe and America and Australia, Japan, is more like 45 to 50 to 60% of people have some college training, or a degree or multiple degrees. And so there's no scarcity value left to that degree. And so the system itself is in crisis, the higher education system, and it's a crisis for people entering it, because they have to think this through in a different way.
Yeah, that's a brilliant answer, and it's certainly not belaboring the point, because you touched on the automation piece there, and we, as humans, have a tendency to assume the sort of near future will be broadly similar to the recent past, but we really are at one of the turning points of economic transformation. And if you're sort of looking to spend 4 years and getting 80 grand in debt, not only are you now competing with extra people than you were previously promised for the roles that are out there, but those roles are in secular decline into the middle class. And people, and this is one of the things I think is very important about your two most recent books, is that you actually, if you look at the numbers, if you crunch the numbers on the promise of middle class opportunity that's been there in theory for the last 40 years, that's going away, and it costs more and more to compete for sort of fewer and fewer seats in this game of musical chairs.
Well put, Gordon. And we can ask, why is that? What's the driver of this? And I think we can draw some insight from Karl Marx, who, as we all know, was perhaps the first, along with some other of the socialist authors such as Proudhon, but was one of the first in the 19th century to create a comprehensive critique of the capitalism that was emerging in that era, in the first industrial revolution, of extreme concentrations of capital and a large workforce that had no capital. and was therefore at the mercy of the people who owned the factories. And in other words, if you needed to buy bread, then you would need a job, and that would mean that you would have to work for a factory and under whatever conditions were presented to you. And so, and of course, this is still the case in developing countries where there's a scarcity of paid work, and then a multinational or global corporation can come in and build a plant and pretty much choose to pay a very low wage because there's few options for the workers. And so that I think that's sort of Marx's basic point, is this system is going to break down because as more capital is created and starts competing with other factories and other enterprises, profits decline, which means there's less money to pay workers, and so there's this relentless pressure on workers' wages and their security. And Marx saw this as a sort of a feedback loop that would lead to the destruction of capitalism. And of course, he was wrong about that prediction in the sense that the ensuing industrial revolutions and social movements redistributed much of that profit to the workforce, and so then the workforce could prosper and start buying goods and services, which created more enterprises and so on. The happy story of the 20th century in terms of rising prosperity. And we can see this in China, that they basically followed that same model, but at an accelerated pace. They accomplished in approximately 30 years what previous countries had taken 100 years to do. So my point here, though, is that Marx foresaw the decline of profits because competition erodes profits. So the only way you can protect profits is to set up a monopoly. But monopolies create stagnation. And so there are no good answers to this conundrum that once you allow global competition, profit margins decline. What do enterprises do? They cut the workforce. If they can't cut wages, then they will try to trim the labor force by buying robots and software, or by making people just work ridiculously longer hours, which is also a trend.
It's the same thing, isn't it? I mean, you're lowering the wage or the cost per hour by making people work more hours. I remember in 07-08 in London, there was a big feature article on the BBC that said Marx was wrong about communism, but he was right about capitalism, because this is as the banks and the Lehman incident and everything were happening. And it's sort of the first, I think, realization filtering out into the wider culture that, things aren't great in the Kingdom of Denmark. And I mean, that we'll sort of stick on the bad news because I've got some glass half full questions to ask you towards the back end of the show. But when you talk about a couple of things happen. So essentially, we're talking about centralization, and the thing that Marx didn't foresee, which was the redistribution you referred to, is a form of decentralization. So this is a bit of a leading question, Charles. But why is centralization bad, and what is moral hazard?
Excellent questions, Gordon, and be sure to interrupt me if I wander too far, because of course these are large topics. But perhaps we should start with the centralization, why it's occurred, why it has come to be the dominant sort of model for economic growth and management. Centralization, of course, offers economies of scale, so that if you have, say, 10 oil refineries sort of scattered about the countryside, this is not necessarily an efficient model because they've got transport costs, and you have to bring in the oil and so on and so forth. And so it was fairly obvious in the 20th century that if you could consolidate all that into one location that was close to the material sources and close to shipping lanes or rivers for transport, then you could make a lot more money by concentrating the workforce and the capital and the production in one place. And so I think World War II was also a key driver in the push from the decentralized model of political control and economic productivity to these highly centralized and controlled systems, so that the nations, the allies, and the Axis nations both could maximize their productivity and to win this world war. And so that model is now reaching what I think is our diminishing returns. In other words, further centralization is not creating any economies of scale. It's actually become, if there's a feedback is reversed, and now it's adding costs. In other words, we see everywhere where large centralized bureaucracies are adding costs via regulations and huge payrolls and that kind of thing, without adding any productivity or economic value. And so what we now see is the digital revolution has enabled the growth of decentralized models that are productive and profitable in ways that centralized enterprises can't be. And this is, of course, we know, like social media, crowd sourcing, and that sort of network approach to productivity, as opposed to a hierarchy in which you take orders, you follow the orders, and that's a productive model.
It's quite a good point, particularly bringing up the war, that centralization isn't a nefarious scheme. It seemed like a good idea at the time because you're fighting a war, but also it strikes me on a political basis as a sort of pre-internet solve for communication. So if you think, I mean, I'm Australian, so we have our federal capital in Canberra, which was built for that reason, to be a place where representatives from other states would come together to kind of run an entire country, which is more or less what Washington is. And these are all initial, almost communication solves for how you run a country. And now we're in a situation of examples of the diminishing returns would be unthinking use of a minimum wage hike or increasing healthcare costs, which sound like a very good idea and win votes. And in theory, they should be a very good idea. The trouble is you add additional cost, and Europe doesn't understand this at all. I mean, the business competitiveness index for Italy is below Soviet countries former Soviet countries like Georgia and Kazakhstan, because the compliance costs are too high. What happens if you put all these costs on a business so that an employee who previously cost you $100 now costs you $2? And still gets sick and still wants to leave and still wants to do things like go and see their children, the option of automating pieces of it becomes much more cost effective, because robots, as far as we know, don't have babies for a start. And then you end up in this world of fewer and fewer jobs, and so you actually have to kind of ratchet up the social costs to pay for the people who don't have jobs, and you end up in almost a runaway climate change effect. And this seems to me... And even if everyone along that chain thinks they're doing the best thing for their country or for their state or for their town or whatever it happens to be, it's running in completely the opposite direction. And this is, as we reach the kind of not halfway mark, but the real grimmest part of the discussion before we start talking about nice things, I'm not sure how that unwinds nicely. And is this why we're going to end up with a digital currency?
I think so. And let me just retrace briefly to mention that you raised the issue of moral hazard, yes, which I think is also key. And I know that's why you connected those two, centralization and moral hazard. Moral hazard is the term that we use to describe the difference in behavior between people who have no risk and people who face risk of consequences for their actions. And so the classic example is the global financial meltdown of, as you say, the 2008, 2009 era, in which bankers who extended very risky loans to marginal lenders and created very risky derivative and securitization products, they in an open market economy, they would have had to face the consequences of those risky bets. They would have had to face the risks and taken the losses, and very likely gone out of business as they were insolvent. And so then the central states jumped in and eradicated the consequences. And so that's moral hazard. They basically saved the banks from the consequences of their risky behavior. And so what that does is it incentivizes the participants who don't have any risk to continue to make very risky bets, because if they win those bets, they get to keep the winnings. And if they lose, the government picks up the tab. And so it's rather like being in a casino and being handed $10,000 and or euros or pounds and being told, go ahead, because you can gamble as much of this as you want, because when that is lost, we're going to give you another 10,000. And so if your losses are going to be covered, it actually incentivizes you to take larger and larger and riskier bets, because there's no downside, and yet the upside if you win is enormous. And so this incentive of protecting concentrations of capital, wealth, and power actually is another of your runaway feedback loops, because the system can't correct itself, because the centralized state and bank are protecting players from the consequences of their actions. And so, as I often say, risk cannot be disappeared. You can never eliminate risk. You can only transfer it to someone else. And so what the whole global financial meltdown really resulted in was the transfer of all this risk from the private sector financialization, system, was transferred to the taxpayer and the governments, and to the system in its entirety. And so one result, which is subtle, is the economies that instituted moral hazard and saved the banks are all stagnating, because the risk that was taken on didn't disappear. It was simply spread throughout the system and working its way into the bones of the system, if you will. And so that was not a fix. That was not a solution. It actually set off a feedback loop, which is still at work and increasing in danger, I think.
Well, yes, it is an inevitable Australian metaphor here, which is a bushfire, and we've just layered a whole lot more dead wood and eucalyptus leaves, and we haven't had the fire. And so when the next one comes through, which it will, it's one heck of a firestorm. It's reminding me of Nicholas Nassim Taleb's discussion of skin in the game, and with increasing centralization, what happens is the errors get bigger. And they happen less often, but when they do happen, they're disastrous. Whereas in a decentralized system, so let's say Britain has very few banks left, but let's say we had 50 banks, and they were all a kind of what banks used to be, local credit unions and that kind of thing. Several of them can go out of business or make bad bets and fail, and it's a disaster for one particular town or what have you. But we can't avoid failure or making the wrong bets in a marketplace. But in a centralized one, you outsource the consequences of the wrong bet as much as you can, until there's one that you just can't, and the whole thing comes tumbling down. Is that a reasonable? Is the bushfire metaphor a good one?
It's an excellent one, Gordon, and also I'm glad you brought up Taleb's point that resilience is a consequence of many small mistakes and crises and failures that, in the sense of like an ecology, uh, a series of small fires that can burn out the deadwood, and these don't threaten the entire ecosystem. But once you pile up the deadwood and never allow it to small fires, then you will get a conflagration. And so that consolidation of power and capital in centralization has led to a situation where, as you say, there's only a handful of big banks that control like 80% of the financial system and the financial bets. There are basically 6 media companies that control most of the media in the United States, and the same concentration is visible in Europe as well. And so, what we've set up or allowed to be created is an extremely fragile system. And that's why Taleb's most recent book, I think, was called Anti-Fragile. And he was talking about, if you want a resilient anti-fragile system, it must be decentralized, and it must everyone participating must have skin in the game, and because that's the only way that the choices and the incentives will be net positive for the system as a whole.
And moral hazard is essentially people who are playing without skin in the game, or they're using your skin when they're playing.
That's right, exactly.
So in returning to the bushfire metaphor, it seems to me that we are about 1 minute to midnight on that bushfire. And so I kind of want to talk about, in the most recent book, you have, which I found fascinating, a kind of a very coherent and extremely well argued version of a digital currency. And this is where we start to get to the glass half full. But before we get there, it seems to me the first digital currencies we will get will be effectively against our will. I think we'll end up with a digital euro and a digital dollar as a result of the sort of last gasp of centralization trying to keep these pieces together. And we're kind of in a stage where that, as cost of capital is starting to increase and the dollar increases, I'm not sure if people have really got their head around what the next few stages, whenever they arrive, will look like. So do we want to talk about the sort of rising dollar and the implications for that for our looming bushfire?
Yes, I think that's again a very large topic, but let's see if we can reduce it down or make a bit of sense of it. Let's start with what money is. And of course, many books have been written about it, but what money really boils down to is it's a social contract, if you will, and it's a political construct. And this social construct of money allows us to exchange goods and services with some other medium. We don't have to barter everything, and it allows us to borrow money from each other, and or run a line of credit and be able to account for that. And so David Graeber wrote an excellent book called The First 5,000 Years. I think it's called Money, The First 5,000 Years.
Debt, isn't it?
Debt,
Yes.
that's right, debt. Yeah,
Great
thank
book,
you.
by the way. Yeah.
Yes, and it taught me a lot, and because one of his primary points is money did not arise just to replace barter. It arose to account for debt and credit, because commerce, even in the pre-modern world, required credit and debt, that you would take a shipment of goods from someone else and be unable to pay for that until you yourself were able to sell the goods. And so that money greases credit, debt, and accounting. But the political aspect is, nowadays in the modern era, money is whatever the central state says it is. In other words, if you try to create an alternative currency within the borders of a state, that state will crush you. You will be breaking the law, and because the state maintains a monopoly on what is considered money. And one definition of what is money is money is what you use to pay your taxes. Because if the state doesn't accept your money, then you become a felon in the eyes of the state. You didn't pay your taxes with the legitimate currency. So what we're seeing now with digital currencies, or more properly cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, is these are currencies which are non-state. And unlike gold, which of course everyone recognizes as money in the sense of it's a store of value that is recognized around the world, it's difficult to exchange and do commerce globally with gold. And there's many schemes now being developed to create a digital sort of currency that's backed by gold, and that's a good idea. That's a fine way of extending gold's utility as a means of exchange, as opposed to just being a store of value. But more exciting to those of us who are looking ahead is the idea that there can be currencies that the state cannot suppress and cannot outlaw because they are stored on massively parallel servers that the state can't shut down. And so this is why Goldman Sachs, for example, was recently patenting its own Bitcoin blockchain type currency ideas. In other words, everybody sees the potential here for currencies that are outside the state's control. And of course, why is that? What does that change? Well, the state can devalue its currency at will, right? It can, any state can announce that we're now issuing a new currency that's, they were taking 10 of whatever the old one was, and now it's worth $1. $10 is now $1. You've lost 90% of your money. Or it can devalue it through inflation by manipulating interest rates and the central bank's asset purchases and so on. And so this leads back to your question about the dollar. And I have argued for many years that the dollar is inevitably going to rise in value against other currencies, and we see this happening on a daily basis, despite various perturbations in the market. The dollar goes up and goes down, but in the longer run, it's going to gain simply because everyone else is trying to devalue their currency to boost their exports. And it's very complicated that we can go very deep down the rabbit hole in currencies. But I think the point is that these state issued currencies are inherently unstable, and that the solution that the central states arrived at after World War II was called Bretton Woods, and it was basically a system that pegged currencies to each other and to gold, and so it was a stable system where everyone knew what their own currency was worth in terms of gold and the dollar. And now it's a free-for-all, a free-floating currency market that trades several $1 trillion worth of currencies daily, if not hourly. And so we sort of are in a quicksand where we're not really sure what the value of our money will be going forward. And this is why many people are fans of gold and silver, because they feel that if they hold gold and silver, they know that asset will not go to zero or lose most of its value when the government tries to save itself by manipulating the currency. But it's a new world with the digital currencies.
Well, it is. I think the flaw in the gold and silver plan is, given that we've just had the last several years of trial balloons from heads of the Bank of England, the editorial board of the New York Times, all these people saying it's time to end physical currency, it's time to end the dollar. Europe's trying to ban the 500 euro note now. You can't carry a certain amount of cash above, I think it's really small, like 2,000 euro or something in France. And part of the reason for this seems to me that in order to fully get to that sort of central bank endgame of devaluation and interest rate manipulation, you need to be able to take, which is beginning to happen in Japan, interest rates very negative, which is essentially a tax on savings. And if that happened today, the Chancellor today is talking about the budget, but if for some reason we had a negative 5% interest rate in UK banks, I could go down to the bank, assuming I got there before everyone else, and withdraw GBP, and then it's not taxed. So this is the piece that I think the sort of other shoe to drop that I think people need to get their head around. And again, I don't think the world we're talking about with the multiple currencies is going to happen anyway. But it seems to me the first step, and this is why I really, really liked your second book. I like the college one as well. Is that it gives people a thought experiment to understand what money is, what's going to happen in the next couple of years, and here are some of the things that could happen. But as we have the options of things like physical currency taken away from us in the last few years, in that sort of, or in the next few years, it seems to me the best first step is for people to get their head around how money works, what price is, so that you can, in theory, use Facebook Messenger to trade something with neighbors, or have that kind of confidence in how markets work, because we'll be in a, one way or the other, nice or rough, we'll be in a multi-currency sort of world.
Yes, I think so, Gordon. And of course, competition is always good, because the more currencies we have access to, if the market is transparent, then we have ways to hedge our bets. We can own a bit of a variety of currencies, and we won't be completely beholden to the whims of the state and central bank. But I'd like to go back and talk a bit about my book, since you were kind enough to say that you liked it. Is the problem with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin is only the wealthy people can own them. In other words, it retains its value because it's scarce. There's only X number of Bitcoins, and mining them is costly and time consuming. And so if you are a poor person in Asia or Africa or in any country, you're not going to be able to get Bitcoin, because you won't have the super fast computers to mine it, and you may not have the skills to do so, and you'll have to have some other kind of money in order to buy a Bitcoin. So my kind of solution to the decline of labor globally, and the decline of the ability to earn money through work, is to create a labor-backed currency, which I call l'argent, or of course it's French, l'argent, in which community groups would choose work projects in their local community to provide what's scarce or what's needed. And they would have to monitor this work and prove that the work was completed, and then they would be issued this cryptocurrency in payment. And if this scheme reached the network effect, which is a term we use to describe when a network of people and nodes reaches a density and a quantity that enables lots of trade, lots of commerce, lots of exchange of ideas, then it can become actually useful. If there's only one group and only or two groups that get paid this new currency, then of course they don't have enough outlets for their money. There's just not enough goods and services for them to do. So that's one of the limits on a digital currency, is it needs to reach the network effect, meaning that there's enough people who have access to the currency and can use that currency to buy goods and services to enable it to become useful. And that's the core of its value. In other words, it's not gold, or it's not Bitcoin in the sense of it's limited and that's the source of its scarcity. Its value is created by its utility. And so that's basically my idea of how to address poverty and the diminishment of labor, and actually put money in the hands of people who are doing work that's useful in their community, but not profitable enough for some global corporation to take it over. So that's a distinction I think a lot of us miss, is if work is highly profitable, some global corporation will jump in and do it. Well, in other words,
exactly.
Yeah.
And the system struggles to price essential community behavior, like feeding an elderly neighbor. Otherwise, the way you do that now is to go to a job you don't like, to make some money, to pay someone else to deliver food to your neighbor, and the companies in between that is an extraction from it. As I read through your system, I'm from the Hunter Valley, so it's a wine growing region. It gets lots of tourists, but it's also a rural area, so you have higher unemployment. There's a port city at one side of it, and it struck me that the sort of thought experiment of your digital currency works remarkably well. The more decentralized you get, the better this is going to work, especially as you can have the currency float up and down against another nearby city if you were going to sell them your wine. And it's just what I want people to go and read the book for is that you get to the end of it and you have a remarkable understanding of whatever system we end up with, and it's going to take a long while to get there. You have the opportunity to kind of get what the potential is here and how price and money work wherever we end up going.
Precisely. And I think the reason why I wrote the book, Gordon, was to present an alternative vision of the future that was not simply an extension of centralized states and banks attempting to centrally manage the economy and society. And of course, the other issue here is we all know that the world will eventually run out of cheap oil. And right now we have an oil glut for a variety of reasons, but it's not a permanent glut by any means. And we have global warming, however you want to address that. We have environmental issues. The seas have been stripped of fish in many areas. All those issues are best addressed at a decentralized level, because once people have skin in the game, in other words, they can make money without exploiting or destroying their local ecosystems, then they have an incentive to protect that value, as opposed to their incentive to go work for the global corporation that's stripping the assets. So
absolutely. It's not only best addressed, it can only be addressed in a decentralized way. You cannot centrally run something that responds ecosystemically like an ecosystem. And you utterly remove things like moral hazard because you completely change the incentives on a local basis, which actually neatly brings me, I guess, I'm glad I knew that you had the philosophy degree, because it brings me towards the sort of, beyond talking about the looming changes in the monetary system, which are going to happen as inevitably as a result of increased automation, as a result of whatever brings on the bushfire. Money is there to... You have two versions of money in the book. You have money that's used as a method of exchange, and you have store of value. And you use gold as an example, but you're actually quite a keen gardener. And you grow a lot of your own food and do that kind of thing, which will resonate quite heavily with the audience here. So I want to spend the last little chunk talking about it seems to me the upside of, for someone who's listening to this show who isn't particularly interested in economics, is that once you get your head around it, it's a brand new day when it comes to valuing the things in your life that actually have meaning. And that seems to me where we get more than glass half full talking about the near future, because a lot of it is going to be quite chaotic and there are a lot of pitfalls ahead. But we need to start thinking about what is in fact valuable, rather than, pieces of paper with a pyramid on them. We need to start thinking about what we want to do with our lives and where we choose to focus our attention. And I think your books give people an idea of that. But so going back to the gardening thing, as we talk into meaning, have you always been a gardener? Or even, let me back that up. Before you answer the gardening question, when did you, would you consider yourself an Austrian economist or just mildly interested in Austrian ideas? And how did you end up thinking about economics and the future of money, having come out of a philosophy degree?
Excellent question, Gordon. And
you got there in the end.
I think that like many of us, when we're in our youth, in our teens and 20s, and in school or university or pursuing our own interests, we are idealistic, and this we look at the world and we wonder, why is it such a mess? Why is it so destructive? Why is it so exploitive and so unsustainable? And so we seek answers to these big questions, and we and many people engage this by joining an environmental group, Sierra Club or Greenpeace. In other words, to engage in some active way in trying to change the world into being a more sustainable model. And other people have other social sort of programs that they join to try to do their part to improve things. But if the system is rigged against all that, and the system is concentrates all the power and wealth in the hands of a few, then it's difficult to really change the world at the edges. And there have been successes where a group of committed people can make positive changes. But I think what I learned from philosophy and perhaps my study of Marx in the university helped me understand capitalism is you're going to have to change the way you create and distribute money. Because if you don't do that, you can't change anything. Nothing really changes. And so this is the problem with all the anti-poverty programs, which, foundations and governments have poured billions of dollars in anti-poverty programs around the world. And the vast majority have failed because they didn't really change the system. The money got funneled off by the corrupt government, or it was used by the foundations for flying off to various meetings and hiring staffers. And so they didn't really change anything in the system. And so just giving people money or building a school someplace that may make people feel like they've accomplished something, but it doesn't really change the structure, the incentives. And so to do that, you have to go right to the source, the way you create and distribute money. And if it's centralized, then you're centralizing power and wealth. There's no way you can fight that. There's no way to stop that process. The only way to have a different system is to decentralize the creation and issuance and distribution of money. And once people have money in their own communities and they're not reliant on the state, then they can start making better choices. And this is why the subtitle of my book is "The Future Belongs to Work That's Meaningful." And of course that's the problem with hierarchies and centralized capitalism is we don't really get to choose our work. I mean, we can choose a field of study that we hope we'll like in university, but ultimately we don't get to choose work that's meaningful to us except in our off hours. And that's where gardening and cooking and actually creating value in your own life come in, right? And so, but I like to imagine a world in which we got to choose meaningful work. And by that, at a minimum, it means doing work that is valued in your own community. And that would be a much better world than the one we live in now.
No question. I think there's a force multiplier associated with gardening, particularly if you're doing sort of fruit and vegetable gardening, which is you can kind of begin decentralizing the things that you have some control over, as well as accruing meaning in your life. Because as a keen gardener, you'll know nothing in the world tastes as good as something you've grown, and that strikes me as almost rebellious. It's almost a finger in the eye of centralization when you do that, considering the absolute atrociousness that is the global food supply chain and the sort of diminishing of minerals from soil and monocultural practices causing desertification on every continent except Antarctica, because they haven't been able to grow anything there yet. and it seems that and I find it dismaying but unsurprising in certain parts of the US that people who want to capture their own water or grow food are suddenly being fined and imprisoned in different little local markets, because there is just something, it has become political now to decentralize anything you possibly can, including at least some of the food that you serve your family.
Yeah, precisely, and that's an excellent point, and that's the diminishing returns on centralized planning and overregulation. But Gordon, you let's talk a bit about the value of gardening and related things that you do for yourself that is creating meaning and value. There's an economic value to it, of course, as you say, that gardening, you're getting a much better quality of food with a much higher density of nutrients because you've nurtured your own soil, you've composted and you've used good stuff, and so your food is more nutritious and so on. But I think the larger point is, instead of looking at money as our store of value and our security, perhaps we need to look at our gardens and our solar panels or our enterprises, our little home enterprises that we're creating goods and services, for our own community or even globally through things like Etsy. You're creating goods and selling them to whoever wants them, and these activities, and if you want to call them, they're assets, and that's the real source of our security. In other words, if I save up $100,000 and I think that's going to be my security, and then it vanishes in some financial crisis, or I put it in Bitcoin and for some reason Bitcoin crashes or something, what was my security? Whereas my real security is the tools I own, my network of friends and contacts that I can create and collaborate with. And so this seems to me to be the future, is like whatever money we have in the form of currency, we would be best invested in ourselves and in helping us create value in our own lives that we can trade with other people. And so this sort of is it goes back to, you could even call it a sort of medieval model where you're creating informal guilds and trading fairs, and that's what the digital world of Etsy and related marketplaces for our goods and services, that's where it's going. And so that's actually a much more resilient and anti-fragile system than trying to choose the right career to go to work for a global corporation that may or may not have that division in 3 or 4 years. And then, in fact, your entire field of study may be revolutionized and eliminated at virtually any time with some new technological leap.
Well, it's not only more resilient, I think it's more appealing for most people. I give talks, industry talks in London occasionally about data strategy and so on. And the last 18 months or so, I've been saying the next stage in digital is analog, because these steps that we were just talking about here, whatever happens after the digital currency, people are talking about gold as a store of value, is looking backwards. For me, in the medium term, a garden and good, strong social bonds with neighbors is better than gold at this point. And I also think it's more desirable. I think we've had maybe 70 or 80 years off living in this way for most of the planet. I mean, I remember growing up, my grandparents lived just up the road, and my grandfather was a keen gardener, so he'd come down with whatever surplus he had, and so there'd be family around and neighbors, and that was just, early 80s. So we're not even talking 1700s here. So we've only recently lost it, and I think even if we can't articulate it, a lot of people are missing it more than they'd realize.
That's so true, Gordon, and I think that really is what we're talking about here. Is that what's been stripped away or strip mined from our lives is not just middle class security, but the sources of meaning in our lives. And I think that I've been thinking a bit about the connection between our soul, which I define in this case not so much spiritually, although of course there is that aspect, but our soul is who we are, what we enjoy doing, not necessarily as a pleasure, but as activities that we forget about the passage of time. That we're not necessarily aware of some intense joy, but what we're aware of is how fun or interesting this task is. And when you're forced to go to work for a global corporation intent on reaping a profit, because if it doesn't reap a profit, then it will go out of business itself, or in a state bureaucracy where following the rules is the whole game, and there's really no productivity beyond you just follow the rules. Where's the meaning in this? And of course, we sense this loss of meaning and purpose, but we seem unable to figure out how to address it. And of course, within the system, it is very hard to address. We need a whole new system. But until that option manifests itself, we're on our own, and we're going to have to find purpose and meaning in ourselves, and I think that, as you say, the idea of money being a store of value, it's actually quite limited, because it's not going to create purpose and meaning, and that it takes activity and community and effort and work to create meaning and purpose.
Well, and this is why, that was a fantastic answer, and this is why I think I push your books and so on so hard, is it's almost like a cosmic trick. It's almost like the end of the labyrinth or something. The stuff that's coming down the pipe is quite grim, but by some cosmic accident, the skill of restoring meaning in your life is always entirely up to you. It costs $3 to go and get some seeds from a nursery and even put them on a balcony in a high rise in Hong Kong. And that's kind of step one. You always have within your power the opportunity to begin that process of decentralization and re-empowerment, digital currency come what may.
Gordon, I think, from what I can gather, are a very adept and in the digital realm, if you will, that you understand the technologies of the digital era. And what I find fascinating, what I'm going to ask you to comment on, is how the digital revolution enables us. It gives us more tools to add purpose and meaning to our lives.
Well, it fundamentally does, as long as, and this is genuinely the movement. I've been talking about it for a while, as I said. The next phase in digital is the return of the real, or the return of the analog. If you look at social and connectivity now, no one under 30 uses Facebook. They view it the same way, we view LinkedIn. It's just something you have to have, but you never use. It's an old people technology used to sign into websites. What they have instead are things that I just can't get my head around because I'm too old for them, which is Snapchat and so on. Now, what Snapchat is, people look at it and think it's some sort of absurd messaging system. Snapchat is the return of the real, because if you don't have a connection with the person, you don't get to see whatever it is. But crucially, because it's a time-based thing, so if I see a weird car or a celebrity on the street, I take a Snapchat and send it to my friend. That then vanishes. So what we think of as ephemeral is actually you missed the real. This is a digital native kids repositioning and revaluing real experiences. The trouble is, internet commentators all tend to be 35 and up, which means the internet has been something they've escaped to from an analog world. If you look at 35 and under, you have people who've only ever had the internet, and they're looking for the real on the other side of it. And this is going to be, although it can't be articulated, where digital analysts keep expecting the next thing to be digital. It's not. If you look at what younger generations are doing now, they are optimizing digital infrastructure for an authentic experience. And that can be anything. And they will be the ones who will tip their waitress using Facebook Messenger. They will be the ones who will have some sort of decentralized farming payment system that goes all the way from Malawi up to whatever arrondissement in Paris they live, and there'll be a carbon offset journey the entire way, and it won't matter to them what system it is. We're looking for platforms like, will Facebook be the next e-wallet? And that's just really unsophisticated thinking. I think we don't, as older people, we don't have the skills to look backwards and see just the sheer proficiency of using redundant digital systems to actually start generating meaning, and it's happening all around us.
That's fascinating, Gordon, and I'm so pleased to have your set the context for this. It really, for it helps us all understand how this the digital revolution is enabling. I don't know quite how to say it. Shall we say networks that enable authenticity and gatherings?
Authentic networks like globally. This sounds almost oxymoronic, but it's not. Globally decentralized networks of shared meaning or purpose. Another example of a digital currency that people are trialing is permacredits. So permaculture communities are trying something that's a sort of kissing cousin to your idea, where permaculture activity or volunteerism is paid with these things, and you can buy stuff from permaculture farms using them. And again, it's nascent. It's a thought experiment. And I think we need to have them. I think we need to have ideas like yours now, because we don't know which one it is. And we probably need to stop fixating on platforms, because the digital world appears to behave like New York restaurants. You kind of have like a 5-year run, and Facebook's clearly approaching its end. And in 12 months' time, Twitter will be approaching its end, just as MySpace and everything else did before. In the meantime, on an organic level, on an analog level, we have learnt how to build a network of intention or authenticity with people who are aligned with purpose. So I don't think, especially with the kids today, they don't care if it's Patreon or if they're buying something with Bitcoin. Those pieces aren't where they're sort of pricing meaning and opportunity. It's something back in the analog world, and frankly, I'm quite bullish about that. I think that's a very good idea. We're sort of selling younger millennials short and thinking these messaging platforms are stupid. They're not. We're the ones still stuck on the internet, and they're off doing something real, even if it is sexting.
That's certainly a strong incentive. Yeah, and I think for as a very old geezer at 62, who I've been following technology as best I can, bought the first Mac and so on back in '85. What interests me is the ability to transfer knowledge, information, and new ways of thinking globally. And that, of course, as we know, knowledge is power. And so with the advent of mobile phones and the cost of an Android phone dropping to very low prices in the developing world, this means that so many more people can access knowledge and information and other like-minded people. And it's phenomenal what the network effect will be from that. And I think my sort of system, which I call CLIMB, the Community Labor Integrated Money Economy, it's trying to grab onto that trend and say, if we can only create these community nodes within this network, then people will be able to enhance their lives because they'll have access to other people's knowledge of what works.
Absolutely. This is, music to my ears. I think in the short term, things are going to be quite shit, frankly. But in the medium to long term, it's anybody's game. And that's quite positive.
I totally agree. Yeah, it's really quite exciting. And I just, it could be that we will have quite a different world in as little as maybe 10 to 15 to 20 years. And so most of us hopefully will still be alive and be able to witness that and be part of it. And that's what's exciting, is to participate. We don't have to be passive in this. We're not in a hierarchy.
Oh, excellent way to round out the discussion there, Charles. So for people who would like to know more, where might they find out more about you and your fascinating ideas?
Please visit me at of2minds.com, where I have samples of my book and my thousands of blog posts for you to skim and explore.
Well, once again, Charles, thank you very much. This was an absolute pleasure, and I learned boatloads, and I'm sure everyone else listening will as well.
I did too. Thank you so much, Gordon.
For those of you who have already picked up a copy of my latest book, The Chaos Protocols, you'll no doubt have detected Charles's influence in a few of the chapters. I was pleasantly surprised, although only until he mentioned it, to learn of his background interests in philosophy and science fiction. This is surprising until it is unsurprising, because it goes to show that when non-crazy people talk about money, they're really talking about meaning. That realization was certainly at the heart of my own journey toward financial literacy and wealth creation. But it wasn't just the money. We talked gardening, what to study at college, centralization, why the future may be brighter than we currently fear, and how the next trend in digital is the return of the real. If you liked what you heard, then please do subscribe in iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or on YouTube. Join the conversation by commenting on the blog or on the Rune Soup Facebook page. Or reach out directly on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.